welcome to the first Dear Digital podcast, Chris. We're going to dive deep into how databases are structured in Odoo and how some people may struggle with slow databases and how we can resolve it actually. But first things first, just introduce yourself.
Of course. My name is Chris. I was introduced to Odoo in 2020, and in 2021, I actually founded my first Odoo agency together with a good friend of mine. And we had a lot of fun doing it, but lately I've been feeling like I wanted a new challenge. And I was actually in contact with some people from Dear Digital, and it was actually a good match, and I decided to continue on my Odoo journey with them. And currently I'm active as a solution architect at Dear Digital, which basically means that I am doing a lot of interesting stuff around technical, functional, and content things. And that's me in a nutshell.
Awesome. Yeah, it's been super nice to have you on the team, man. And I'm excited to have this discussion as well. Just because I love to dive into these things, get a better understanding to basically just help our customers better. In this case on Odoo, help them to be more successful in Odoo. But let's dive into the meat of the discussion. Like I said, we're going to dive into databases. Why? Because I hope that sometimes we see that customers have slower databases, have some issues and questions around it. So this is how the topic actually came about. I heard it in a couple of different discussions that I had with customers, potential customers, leads, people that are just on Odoo. So we just want to try and take a step back, understand how Odoo is structured, so that we can maybe understand why exactly it could be that a database is slow. So maybe we start with a question first for you. Is it really the case that some people struggle with a slow database?
It's definitely the case, but oftentimes it's a wrong diagnosis of a problem. Because before we can actually answer that question, it would be good to get a better understanding on how Odoo as a software system is set up. And roughly speaking, it's comprised of two big parts: the Odoo server, which is a Python-based server, and the database, which in the case of Odoo is always a Postgres database. A really nice analogy to understand the relationship between the both is that you can see the Python server of Odoo as the brains of the operation and the database as the beating heart. So they both have very vital functionalities, but very different in nature. So most of the business logic actually happens in the Odoo Python server, and most of the heavy lifting and vitality is given through the database by storing data, retrieving data, keeping the relationships and the data integrity correct. So a lot of users, when they use the Odoo system and noticed some performance issues or some slowness, are quick to point the finger to the database by saying, oh, my database is slow. But it's actually a very dangerous assumption to make, because the business logic that's happening on the Odoo server is also very important, and in some cases even more important when it comes to the overall time you need to actually get the interaction that you expected from the system. If we think about it, right, the Odoo Python server is a very rich and powerful system that has a lot of functionalities that usually do help the clients, but misuse of them can actually really affect the performance on a very high level. We have a lot of automatizations like on create hooks, on write hooks if we're updating data. We also have things like automated actions. We have things like scheduled actions that run on the background. All these things can have a severe impact on the performance of the Odoo system. And those are things that we can't just ignore whenever we encounter some performance issues on the system. Usually, for a lot of the customers that do have some performance issues, it's actually just enough to provide the database, the Odoo Python server, more resources. So we can think about things like more RAM memory, or even activate more workers, because there's just a issue with a lot of concurrent traffic that can be handled by the amount of workers.
Well, where is that handled, what you're just talking about? Because if you have the SaaS application, that happens automatically. And if you have the Odoo SH or a different server setup where you host your database or your Odoo application, like, how do you think about this? Because maybe some people just use the SaaS solution, other people use a different solution. Is it different what you're saying, or? Yeah.
So usually if we really think about it, we have three types of customers when they're on Odoo. We have the people who are Odoo SaaS. We have the people who are on Odoo SH for like a actual server with a staging and a production. And we have some users that have a on-premise setup somewhere. So the people with the on-premise setup will probably already know much about their server and how much resources are available.
We can discard that one, yeah.
The Odoo SaaS users, they do tend to have not that much control over how performant the server is being provisioned. So that's definitely a reason to maybe scale up to an Odoo SH, where you have way more options to like specify how many workers, how many resources they have. So I think in the Odoo SaaS, there's just a hard limit to how performant the system will be in terms of resources. I think in those cases, to get to a better server setup, they probably would have to upgrade to an SH, which is a relatively small upgrade, of course, but still something that will probably have an effect on the price, because if you think about it, the Odoo SaaS price is fixed. So it's kind of logical that the resources on that plan would be fixed as well.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So the easiest way to go about it is probably to go to an SH. And there we do have a lot of configuration options that are embedded in your contract to how much of the resources are actually available for your Odoo system.
Okay, cool. Then maybe just one last question, I think, or maybe two about the basic setup. So if you talk about a database, because sometimes if you're not an IT person, it's hard to imagine what that actually is. I always just imagine it as an Excel file. It's just rows and columns, basically.
Yeah.
So I think that helps as a mental model for people to understand what we're talking about. And then maybe just one more thing about everybody knows probably that Odoo has different modules, right?
Mm-hmm.
Different apps that you can use. And all of the data that you get in these different modules, or you have to write them to the database, to the Excel. They're all actually in one big Excel from what I understand, but you can obviously pick in if that's not the case. So it's basically an Excel file, one huge Excel file with all of the data you have in Odoo, and the different modules, basically they refer to different tabs in your Excel file sometimes. So basically, when you do something on your screen with your user interface of Odoo, I think there was also something like ORM that you talked about before in the little discussion we had before, to like route it to the right parts of Odoo and the databases, etc. So maybe if you can just explain that really shortly, and if my explanation that I just gave is more or less correct, then I think we have more or less everything to dive into it.
It was a very nice explanation indeed. So Odoo has a very monolithic architecture when it comes to the database. So it's one big database with a lot of tables. As you summarized, one Excel with a lot of different tabs. It's a very nice analogy, and that's actually the case. So it's definitely one of Odoo's best decision, if you ask me. So they like to reuse the same models. For example, the famous model REST partner for context within Odoo can be altered by several different modules. So modules by themselves, they don't really implicate new data models. They like to reuse the same models to extend existing functionality. So a lot of the ideas behind Odoo is really focused on like a lot of big tables that are known, like the sale order, the contact, the purchase order. These things are being altered and reused by all the different modules in the system. And luckily for us, the communication between Odoo and the database is actually happening through an ORM. So an ORM stands for Object Relation Mapping. And the easiest way to explain it is it's like a sort of Python native way to actually communicate with the database. So, the typical Odoo developer is never writing a raw SQL query to Postgres. They just use Python as they would use for any other platform, and there is a smart translation layer that will translate those actions in Python into queries. For a lot of technical people, this is like a big hot debate, like are ORMs actually useful or not? Because as you can guess, they do have a lot of benefits on the level of productivity for the developers. So a product like Odoo that's constantly evolving and is really all about business logic and adding a lot of functionality is actually benefiting a lot from the fact that the average Odoo developer does not have to be a SQL expert.
Exactly.
Actually get a lot of nice functionalities added to the system. But on the other hand, think about it, right? If things have to be very generic and work for everything, they tend to have to make broad assumptions. So one big gripe a lot of people have with ORMs, especially in the case of Odoo, is if you actually take a look at what kind of queries come out of the Odoo system, they aren't always the most optimized queries, right? So they might tend to be a little bit slower than if they were written by hand. But that's the trade-off that we have to make, right? Like if we have to start writing every single query just for the idea of making it more performant, we'll actually end up with a system that's very hard to maintain, hard to scale. And that's definitely against the philosophy of Odoo that tries to bring a new improved version every year. So,
But this is just so interesting what you're saying, because this is actually what I want to pinpoint in those kinds of discussions. It's to try and understand a bit all of the hard decisions that a platform like Odoo has to take. And obviously, in every decision that you take, there is a balance. And so I just love what you're explaining of how you think Odoo took those decisions and why they took them.
yeah.
And indeed, they might have some bad effects, but they also have a lot of good effects. So it's always very nice if you just frame it in that way, because maybe if you have a slow database, you're like, but how is this possible? But then again, you also need to see all of the positive sides of it. And indeed, maybe there is one thing that we can also approach in a certain way. That's what we're going to talk about, to maybe make that bad influence, not so bad for you. But indeed, it's also very important to understand what all of the positive consequences are of the decisions that were made. So yeah, I'm going to let you go on.
Yeah.
This is super interesting to me.
So, to have a fast moving platform that can really stand the test of time and really add a lot of nice tools and benefits, it was a hard decision to keep the technology a lot more simple. So an ORM simplifies a lot of these issues and makes it possible that a lot of developers on the Odoo platform can be very productive and can actually really just start with the business logic without actually worrying too much about what's going on under the hood in the database. Of course, don't get me wrong, Odoo has a very talented team that actually keeps working on the ORM and keeps making improvements, and that allows us to have two separate tracks. People who are focused on the business logic will do their thing, and the experts within Odoo will keep working on the ORM for it to make smarter and smarter queries. But it's just the fact that it's a provably more difficult way to get nice queries if you're making it general for the whole application.
Cool. Okay, so let's maybe then just dive in from your perspective, because you have a lot of experience with Odoo and development experience. Where are typical areas when slowness can be experienced for customers? Because again, we are going to approach this from a customer centric way. So how would you define what people try to do and maybe experience slowness? So for example, they want to get a report out of Odoo, and maybe that's just one technical thing that I want you to touch upon before you dive into all of the details. Because this is like one big Excel with different tabs, people might experience this as well if they make Excels, that you maybe have to search for a specific thing in another tab. So you basically make joins of specific things within this database. And this is typically, from what I understand, also quite resource heavy and sometimes hard to do. So is this one of the issues when people could experience some slowness, and how can maybe those be resolved? The resolution maybe we can hold for later, but can you just zoom in maybe to the joins of the databases and what that might have as an effect potentially on the experience of the customer?
Yes, definitely. So we need to understand we're working on an ERP, which is usually something that touches on various different types of data. So it wouldn't be a surprise if you actually take a look under the hood that Odoo has to do quite a lot of joins to actually get some useful business data, especially for reports. And it's true that on a technical level for SQL, that joins are a pretty expensive operation to do. And this is something that we sadly can't abstract away, right? I think Odoo already made some very nice decisions by really allowing data tables to be pretty wide, right? Because this is something that is very technical, but it's interesting for a lot of people. You can basically choose the degree or how normalized or denormalized your data tables are, right? Are you having a lot of small tables that have very specific information that you have to join to get some good data, or do you have very wide tables that have a lot of data already without needing a lot of joins? I think on that level, Odoo already does a great job, right? Contacts have a lot of information on the table itself. So the amount of joins that happen aren't excessive in the sense of how the structure is designed for Odoo. The joins that do happen are very necessary, and it's just a hard reality that we can't avoid.
Okay, so maybe I'll just try to explain and you can tell me if I'm wrong. So just to make it concrete for the customers or for people that are less technical. So for me, a join, for example, would be, imagine that you ask the system to get the data of the sales for a certain geography. So what you could then understand as a join, probably it's not the case in Odoo, but just to try and explain it, you have like a record that says Sam bought, which is me, I'm a customer, Sam bought €1,000. But to know which geography I'm in, it needs to go to my address. And maybe the address is part of Sam, which is my customer database. So then basically, if I ask the question, okay, can you give me the sales for a geography? Then Odoo needs to list up the sales, but they don't know which geography I'm in because now they know that Sam bought €1,000, but they have to go into another database and see, okay, Sam is from Ghent. So then they need to join everything together for all of these lines, and they need to look up which geographies all of these different customers in this one database has, and then make up what we basically ask the query to be. So this is an easy example of what a join is. So I just wanted to explain this easily. Maybe this is not a good example because maybe it doesn't work like this in Odoo, but this is the concept basically.
It's a great example.
And what you said about normalization, I think, again, from a technical perspective or from a non-technical perspective, is that I think they speak about normalized databases when this data about me, Sam, in my case, is also in this one table because all of the information about Sam, my address, etc., is actually added. And then you can understand very well what you said about the width, basically, of the Excel that we're talking about, is that all of the columns, also the address, etc., of Sam is also included in the database or in the tab or in the Excel where we have my orders. So it's already joined, basically, right?
And typically, because that's a question a lot of people have is, oh, that sounds great. Why don't we have super wide
everything in one
all the time? Well, think about it. If for every single thing that we talk about Sam, every single record will have to duplicate the same information, we will have gigantic databases while we only need a link to Sam if Sam himself has all his information. So it's another balance that we have to find. There's a lot of
so interesting
going on. Like, how much do you want to keep the database small by having everything in its own table, which is nice from the data capacity perspective, but terrible from the performance perspective because those things are separate. And every time the user wants to get some relevant information, they have to be joined again, and that will slow down the database when it comes to performance. So I think, in my personal opinion, Odoo does have a really nice happy medium. Everything that they can put in one table, they definitely do so. It's also part of the philosophy behind Odoo. Most Odoo developers, they don't just create new tables, they just add the information into the existing tables. And that does seem to help a lot, but obviously it's not always enough because, as you know, a lot of users have very specific needs when it comes to reporting, but sometimes it's actually interesting to leverage a lot of different opportunities within Odoo. For example, we have customers that have very important reports that they want to have, which will have to trigger very heavy queries, but it's clear that they actually don't need to run it that often. It's very interesting to maybe then think about some background cron jobs, so some action that will run in the background to create the report and then to save it into a certain file format so it's ready to be viewed at any time, because maybe the data related to that report is not changing. So these are little things that we can leverage to avoid those scenarios where very heavy queries that need to interact with a lot of tables should be a painful experience. If somebody knows that every morning at 8 a.m., the report for that day is already set up and compiled into a PDF for viewing reasons, then that's one way to already solve one issue related to performance. But not every single thing is possible to be solved by just running in the background. That's true.
No, but that's why we also need to understand, like you say, it's very important why you need this specific report, right? And then we can try to make sure we implement it in a way that the user experience is not like slow. Because from what I understood as well in the discussion that we had before is that every time you basically want to make a report, always Odoo starts from scratch and queries the database. So if you think about it from that perspective and you make a lot of reports, then you indeed might want to go into the pathway that you just described, because otherwise, every single time you basically do the new query, everything starts from scratch, which then makes a lot of sense that it might be slow, because maybe actually you're saying to the system, okay, let's forget everything we know before and let's start over again. And if that's a big ask that you have, yeah, that will take a long time. So maybe it's nice to just put your historical data somewhere in a report if you need that, because that doesn't change anymore, right? Potentially. And then maybe have the up-to-date information that maybe queries, but don't get all of the heavy stuff about the historic part with it, because it will do that as well.
Yeah, and the thing is, once again, a lot of these things have specific context that makes sense. You have some reports that actually are based on data that's constantly changing, and then it's amazing that Odoo, by default, will always refetch the most recent data, right? Like, if you need some sales report from a company that has a lot of transactions, then it's actually good that you can see the sales of the last hour or the last 15 minutes. But that's the default for Odoo. So anything that we do in a system is always trying to get the freshest batch of data, which is a nice thing if that's really what you need. But oftentimes we notice that a lot of customers actually don't need data that fresh, and they are a little bit constipated by the fact that all this data retrieval is taking so much time. And those are the moments where we can actually leverage a lot of Odoo's other functionalities to have some static reports or some things that are like already processed into a specific file in the evening, in the morning, and then they can just take that data and run with it and do whatever they need. But it's true for customers that do have like a very retrieval heavy process where they're reading a lot of big data. It's very possible that the standard way that Odoo communicates with the database is not ideal, and the fact that it will slow down their experience is something that can be helped if we look at it from a different perspective.
Cool. Maybe just one topic that I want to touch upon, maybe it's a bit early, but just to dive into it while we're talking about it, is caching also, could it be an option? Because you're talking about already retrieving it and putting it somewhere. Can we, or because I think you talked about a specific way that Odoo also like has the option to make sure that some things can be cached. Can you maybe talk about that a bit as well?
So definitely, Odoo does support some level of caching in and of itself, especially on the level of the ORM. It's usually more so related to people that maybe make custom developments. They can use like an in-memory cache in Odoo itself, where the ORM knows that it doesn't have to fetch from the database. But a very interesting thing to think about is, and which is very technical, is the way Odoo decides to communicate with the database is very smart, but it has some drawbacks, right? So the ORM that Odoo has developed likes to take every single action that happens within a request. So for example, you click on a button and you request to see a list of customers. That's a request that will go to the server, which will communicate with the database and then return the list of users. Well, that request will always happen in one transaction. And just for you guys to know, what's the benefit of working with a transaction? A transaction is basically like summarizing everything you need from the database and only doing it once you're done with all the steps. So for example, maybe you want to update 3 customers, make a new order, and then maybe check something else. in a normal, non-transactional way, the database would do all those things in sequence really fast. But maybe one of those things might not have been a good thing. Maybe it was a wrong update, and then it's too late. Then it already happened. With a transaction, you can actually already register all the changes you want to do to the database, but only really do them at the end when you're sure that everything is correct. What's a good example of it? For example, let's say you have a process with a lot of automatizations, right? You make a customer, and once the customer is made, you do a lookup on that customer and you try to send a personalized email. If for some reason something might go wrong in that process, maybe the customer doesn't have a valid email address or something of that nature, it would be nice for Odoo to actually know, okay, everything we try to do, we can't do it, let's roll back. And having a transaction actually makes it possible to try things. And once you're sure everything is correct, then you write it to the database and then you actually make a permanent change to your system. But by working with transactions, we can actually roll back and not go through with the changes because something about the transaction was inconsistent, which gives Odoo the power to be very reliable and avoid inconsistent states based on bugs, issues, or things that happened during the process. But the fact that it works with transactions means that the database is always in the dark until it gets like a big batch of changes. So usually, naturally, a lot of people, when they hear, okay, the database is slow, they can do a lot of database tuning, adding some extra information to allow the database to work with some kind of caching. So if you know that you are viewing something often, instead of getting the data every time, you can actually store it in memory and allow the database to be even more efficient by just knowing the general usage of the data. But because everything happens in one transaction, you don't have the fine-grained control to actually know, okay, this data will be changed, so I have to refetch it or not. And that makes it very hard for Odoo natively to really be cache efficient on the database level. So the thing is, caching on the database side for Odoo is basically not happening. But as we talked about earlier, the benefit of that is that we can work on transaction level and we can really have a consistent and stable database. So it's a loss in the sense of performance, but it's a big gain in the sense of how stable the architecture is. Because think about it, right? Most people that are on Odoo are usually online, and for them, usually the performance is not a big issue. So it's a very specific case where the data sets are that large that the database is being the bottleneck for general performance.
Okay, cool. Then one of the topics that you hit before was cron jobs. There might be quite a lot of issues around cron jobs, so maybe you can dive into that as well.
Definitely. So cron jobs are, in the Odoo context, usually called scheduled actions, or jobs that I can actually run in the background and do a lot of helpful things for us without us interacting with the UI. So maybe send some promo mails or pull in some data from a different platform and process it. These things that don't really need manual intervention, they can be put into a cron job. But the problem with cron jobs is they are very powerful, but with that power comes a lot of responsibility. Because if you think about it, these cron jobs can actually take resources away from the normal server. So while you are using the system as any other user, you're basically competing for the same resources as the cron job. So they count like invisible
users
or users, and their usage of the resources have to be very strict and very controlled. But the problem with cron jobs are if they are not being managed correctly. For example, a very easy mistake to make is bad scheduling, right? If you don't think about it and you schedule 20 cron jobs for 9 a.m. and they will all run on 9 a.m., you basically already signed a death seal for your system on 9 a.m. because all these cron jobs will be fighting for the resource of actually doing their job. But if it's easier and possible, it would be nicer to actually spread them out throughout the day. So you have like small peaks in usage due to the cron job, but over several times. Usually it's even better to let them run on downtimes of your business. A lot of businesses have a lot of downtime. They don't operate within certain hours. Your server can perfectly operate within those hours and do the cron jobs at that time. So that's a very easy thing to fix, right? Like make sure that the schedule...
You have to manage them nicely and think about the schedule and think about the fact that they're actually users and make sure it doesn't interact with the other users that might want to use the system, etc. Yeah.
So we have to be strategic about it, right? Like let's make sure that they don't run too close of each other. Make sure that they run at downtime where it doesn't matter that they're using a lot of resources. These are very smart things to consider. But the other thing is we also need to be mindful of the health of the cron jobs. When I say the health of a cron job is the cron job running in a healthy manner? Can it like end gracefully? Because one of the things that we encounter with a lot of our customers, at some point, there is a cron job that is misbehaving. And what is misbehaving? It's actually trying to do something. It doesn't succeed, maybe because there is like a error with the data, or maybe because it's such a long process that it's actually hitting the CPU time limits, and it's being killed by the system, which is normal, right? Odoo needs to make sure that cron jobs can't run for 24 hours on end. So there is like a built-in limit to how long they can run. It's technically a little bit easy to configure, but if it does hit that limit, then it gets killed. It's not done, so it's still scheduled to run the next time. So we get these cron jobs that actually never get done and keep running, and keep draining the resources, because in your planning you said it needs to run once at 9 a.m. and then it doesn't. But at 9 a.m. it tried, 30 minutes later it failed, so it will try again. And before you know it, you have a cron job that's running the whole day, hogging up resources and not even accomplishing its task. So it's doubly bad. So it's hard to monitor these things, and you really need to keep a close eye on how the cron jobs are evolving. Are they all being done? Is the execution date moving along? Are they really reaching that point? And usually for a lot of people, it's not a concern, but we have noticed that just fixing the cron job situation already severely improved the performance of some customers that we had.
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Very cool. A couple of things that I've noted down, but then I'll let you maybe finish it off with some final thoughts. I think you talked about the fact that you can also see all of these things, right? So obviously the system just reports the logs, etc. Normally, I don't necessarily think that it's done or that you can see it, but you can activate something to try and understand what might be causing the delay, because you might be getting a view into what the system is actually doing, maybe in the background, like you said about cron jobs. So this is something that you can do, right?
Definitely. So Odoo has natively support for a profiler that you can activate, which will actually really maybe slow down the system for a while, but it will take the time to really write down everything it's doing. So what pieces of code are interacting with the system, and even the queries that are being ran. So you can actually see what kind of queries are being ran during the day and how long they take, to really see if there are like some sore spots or things that are really affecting the performance. So the profiler is definitely something that not a lot of people are aware of, but it's a very important tool for us to do an audit of the performance. And it's completely available in the standard. Like you don't even have to you don't need to use any extra tools. It's actually provided to you in the system. And with the profile, you can actually really see in detail where it possibly could go wrong. For the cron jobs, right, it might be a little bit different, right? We have in-house our own tricks and experience to really scope out those issues. But in general, like performance issues, what's taking long, where's the time going, the profile will be very helpful in identifying those things.
Cool. And then one last topic for me, archiving data. How should people potentially think about that? Like if you're running Odoo is successful, more and more businesses will probably be running Odoo for years and years and years in the coming years, and hopefully more in the next years. is it a thing that you could say, okay, try to maybe make your daily experience better by archiving certain data that you don't necessarily need on the day-to-day basis?
Yes. So, in my personal opinion, archiving is underrated. I understand that in the general context of performance, archiving actually doesn't do that much because it's a soft delete, right? If you archive records in Odoo, you actually just set a Boolean flag to active is false. So, for the database itself, it doesn't really change a whole lot because the data still exists. But on the side of the client, it actually could resolve a lot of problems. For example, you need to think about it, right? It's a whole system from database to server to actually the client on the front end that has to do some data processing. So, for example, we noticed, for example, that the Kanban view, which is a very visually rich view, has a lot of processing hiccups because you actually have to make a tile for every single record that you have. And technically speaking, for the Kanban, it's not really hidden in a limit of like 80 records like the list view. So it actually does a lot of data processing. So we notice, for example, for some customers, especially like a big field service company that has like, let's say, 200 people on the road and they have several tasks of the week. If they open the Kanban view, it was actually a serious resource drain. And switching to the list view made it a lot easier because
Is that because you have pagination, like in the list view, you mean?
you have pagination by default, which you don't have in
Yeah.
the Kanban.
Okay,
A
exactly.
lot of people will tell me, but I actually really need the Kanban view. So what can we do? Well, by actually keeping the records that you need alive and archiving the records you don't need, you can actually significantly reduce the drain on the system by only showing
Interesting.
very relevant data. So from a very technical point of view, archiving won't improve like your query speed, but it will definitely allow a lot of the visual things happening in Odoo to be more lightweight because it's only relevant to the records that you actually need. So records that are done and are needed, it's actually good practice to archive them as much as possible to allow those small wins as well.
Cool. Super nice. Thank you so much. I mean, it's been very interesting for me, at least, so hopefully for the listeners as well. Are there any closing thoughts from your end now that you're all fired up on performance and database stuff?
Yeah, maybe just like a quick little shout out to like an interesting tool, right? Because we talked about database performance. As I said, it's usually for most people interesting to start out by checking if the Python server itself is not being the bottleneck, right? Making sure that the resource usage is fine, you have enough workers, you have enough random access memory on the server, and then the next step is turning on the profiler to see if maybe it is indeed some queries that's causing a lot of issues. And it's rarely useful for most customers, but very big customers that really do have so much data that the database is the big bottleneck. There is actually a database proxy service that actually allows us to gain a lot of caching functionality that technically wasn't possible due to the transaction level logic. It's called Heimdall, and it's actually a tool specifically developed around Odoo's, issues. And it's a very powerful thing that can really change the trajectory of a customer's experience with the database. But the reason why we rarely even advise users to be on that is one, you will need a more custom setup, right? It's not possible for the SaaS users, for example. And second of all, it's a completely different piece of software altogether with its own license. So it does have a extra cost, but it's actually interesting to see that even the bigger customers that have like very specific performance needs, we just want to make them aware that Odoo does have solutions for those cases. So it really just depends on how far we need to go to get the performance there. But in my opinion, any type of business with any type of numbers can actually run on Odoo, but it will just depend on how custom we might have to get with the solutions in terms of database optimization and performance.
Very, very nice closing thoughts, I would say. So thanks a lot, Chris. It was awesome talking to you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks for being here, and hopefully everybody enjoyed, and maybe we'll be up for a next topic. If you have any topic that you would like to discuss, or us to discuss like this, please also let us know. So thanks a lot, and see you next time.
Thank you guys. Bye bye.